And lo, the beast looked upon the face and from that day forward.
So you are ready for this voyage, Miss Darrow?
No. Should I be?
And if you will, an uncharted island.
There's a wall ahead!
Shoot my picture. Of course it's deserted. The place is a ruin.
What took her, Carl?
Explore the epic adventure behind King Kong 2005, the giant, the island, and the untold secrets. From insane behind the scenes facts to hidden details you probably missed. Welcome to MB Film Facts, where movies get bigger, deeper, and way more interesting. King Kong is a 2005 epic monster movie directed, co written, and produced by Peter Jackson. It is the ninth film in the King Kong franchise and the second remake of the original 1933 movie with the same name. The first remake came out in 1976. The film stars Naomi Watts, Jack Black, Adrian Brody, Thomas Kretschmann, Colin Hanks, Jamie Bell, and Andy Serkis, who performed Kong using motion capture technology. The story is set in 1933 and follows an ambitious but dishonest filmmaker who tricks his actors and a hired ship crew into traveling to the mysterious Skull Island. Once they arrive, they discover dangerous prehistoric creatures and a legendary giant gorilla called Kong. The crew eventually captures Kong and takes him back to New York City. The development of the movie started in early 1995 when Universal Pictures asked Peter Jackson to direct a remake of the original 1933 film. However, the project was delayed in early 1997 because several other ape and giant monster movies were being made at the same time. Jackson also decided to focus on directing the Lord of the Rings film series instead. After the first two Lord of the Rings movies became huge commercial successes, Universal returned to Jackson in early 2003 and showed interest in restarting the project. Jackson finally agreed and production moved forward. Filming for King Kong took place in New Zealand from September 2004 to March 2005. At the time of its release, it became the most expensive movie ever made, with the budget increasing from an original $150 million to a record-breaking $207 million. King Kong premiered in New York City on December 5, 2005. It was released in theaters in New Zealand on December 13 and in the United States on December 14. The movie received strong praise from critics and appeared on several top 10 lists for 2005. Many people appreciated the visual effects, performances, large scale action, and how it honored the 1933 original film. However, some viewers criticized its long runtime of about 3 hours. The movie was a commercial success, earning more than $557 million worldwide. It became the fourth highest grossing film in Universal Pictures history at that time and the fifth highest grossing film of 2005. When it was released on home video in March 2006, it also made around $100 million in DVD sales. The film won 3 Academy Awards for Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Visual Effects. A tie-in video game was released alongside the film, and it also became successful both commercially and critically. In 1933, during the Great Depression, a struggling New York City vaudeville performer named Ann Darrow is hired by a financially desperate filmmaker Carl Denham to star in his new movie alongside actor Bruce Baxter. Anne is unsure about joining the film at first, but she changes her mind when she finds out that her favorite playwright Jack Driscoll is writing the script. The crew begins filming aboard the SS Venture, a small cargo ship owned by the Dutch East Indies colony, docked in Surabaya and commanded by Captain Engelhorn. Carl tells everyone that the ship is heading to Singapore, but he secretly plans to travel to the mysterious Skull Island to shoot his movie. Captain Engelhorn starts to worry about the trip after hearing his crew talk about possible danger. During the journey, Anne and Jack spend time together and slowly fall in love. The ship later receives a radio message telling Engelhorn that there is a warrant for Carl's arrest because he ignored the studio's order to stop production. The message instructs Engelhorn to change course to Rangoon, but before he can do so, the ship gets lost in heavy fog and runs aground near Skull Island. Carl and several others go ashore, including cameraman Herb, assistant Preston, and boom operator Mike. They are suddenly attacked by natives who kill Mike and one crew member. Inglehorn manages to rescue the group and they prepare to leave the island. However, the natives secretly kidnap Anne to offer her as a sacrifice to Kong, a giant 25-foot tall ape. Jack notices that Anne is missing and the crew returns to the island. Kong takes Anne deep into the jungle and Carl catches a glimpse of the creature. Excited by what he sees, Carl becomes determined to film Kong. Captain Engelhorn organizes a rescue mission led by First Mate Hayes and Jack, with Carl, Herb, Baxter, and Preston joining them. As they travel through the island, they get caught between a herd of large grazing dinosaurs and a group of predators hunting them. This causes a deadly stampede that kills Herb and several others. Baxter and some members return to the ship, but the rest continue searching for Anne. Meanwhile, Anne tries to entertain Kong using her vaudeville performance skills. Over time, she realizes that Kong is intelligent and capable of emotion, and he begins to trust her. The remaining rescue party continues through the jungle, but Kong suddenly attacks them. He kills Hayes and causes the others to fall into a deep ravine where Carl loses his camera. Kong later saves Anne from three large dinosaur-like predators and takes her to his mountain den. Down in the ravine, the surviving rescue members are attacked by giant insects and many are killed. Preston, Carl, Jack, and Hayes' young apprentice Jimmy are eventually rescued by Baxter and Englehorn. Jack decides to search for Anne alone, while Carl becomes focused on capturing Kong. Jack finds Kong's lair and accidentally wakes him up, but he manages to escape with Anne. They return to the crew, who are ready to capture Kong as he chases them. Anne begs the crew not to hurt Kong, but he attacks and kills several sailors. Carl finally knocks Kong unconscious using chloroform. Back in New York City around Christmas time, Carl presents a Broadway show called Kong, the Eighth Wonder of the World. The show stars Bruce Baxter and features Kong chained on stage. Anne refuses to be part of the performance, so another chorus girl takes her place. Kong becomes agitated when he realizes the girl is not Anne, and the flashing cameras make him even more angry. He breaks free from his chains, destroys the theater, and runs into the streets of New York searching for Anne. He chases Jack before finally finding Anne again. The US Army attacks him, and Kong tries to escape by climbing to the top of the Empire State Building with Anne's 6 Navy biplanes arrive and begin attacking Kong. He manages to destroy 3 of them, but he is badly wounded by gunfire. Mortally injured, Kong looks at Anne one last time before collapsing and falling from the building. Jack reaches the top to comfort Anne as they watch Kong fall. On the street below, civilians, police officers, and soldiers gather around Kong's body. One man says that the airplanes killed him. Carl pushes through the crowd, looks at Kong's lifeless body, and sadly says it wasn't the airplanes, it was beauty killed the beast. Casting alright, so if you ain't seen Peter Jackson's King Kong from 2005, what are you even doing? This movie is straight up one of the most epic blockbusters ever dropped in the 2000s. We're talking a 3 hour monster ride packed with jaw dropping action, emotional moments, and a cast that brought their absolute A game. Peter Jackson, the same dude who gave us the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, went all out on this one. And one of the biggest reasons this flick works so well, the casting. Pure fire top to bottom. Let's break it all down, character by character, actor by actor, no cap. Naomi Watts as Andaro, the leading lady who carried the whole thing. Let's kick it off with the queen herself. Naomi Watts plays Anne Darrow, a broke vaudeville actress who's literally down bad at the start of the movie. She's hustling in Depression era New York City, struggling to find gigs, and things are real rough for her. She literally gets caught trying to snag an apple from a fruit stand. That's how desperate things are for her. That's when Carl Denham spots her and brings her into his wild little movie scheme. Now here's the tea. Watts, Jack Black, and Adrian Brody were Peter Jackson's first picks for their roles, and no other actors were even considered. That's how locked in he was on this cast. Watts prepared super seriously for this role too. She actually went and met Fay Ray, the original actress who played Anne Darrow back in the 1933 version of King Kong. That's some deep respect for the legacy right there. Jackson even wanted Fay Ray to make a cameo in the 2005 film and say the very last line of dialogue, but sadly, Ray passed away during pre production at 96 years old. Rest in peace to a legend. What makes Watts' performance so crazy impressive is that she had to act alongside a creature that literally wasn't there on set. Kong was all CGI, all digital, yet somehow Watts managed to build this real heartfelt emotional connection with a giant ape that didn't exist in front of her. She had to react to nothing and make it feel like everything. The bond between Anne and Kong became the emotional backbone of the entire movie, and a lot of that credit goes straight to Watts for just going all the way with it. Jack Black as Carl Denham, the hype man who took it too far. Okay, Jack Black as Carl Denham. This was a wild casting choice, and honestly, it slapped harder than most people expected. Denham is this fast talking, super ambitious, morally shaky film director who basically drags everyone into danger because he's obsessed with making the greatest movie ever. He's got debts, he's got schemes, and he's got absolutely no chill. Jackson cast Black specifically based on his performance in High Fidelity 2000. That movie showed Jackson that Black could bring serious dramatic energy alongside his naturally funny, larger than life personality. And that's exactly what Denham needed. Someone who feels big and bombastic, but also feels genuinely dangerous in the way that obsession can be dangerous. To prep for the role, Black studied two legends, P.T. Barnum, the ultimate showman, and Orson Welles, the bold and reckless filmmaker. Black said he didn't copy Welles move for move, he just wanted to capture that spirit, the reckless confidence, the I don't care about the consequences energy. Denham was basically modeled after Orson Welles by the writers themselves, so Black was literally studying the source material. That's doing your homework for real. Some folks thought Black was a little miscast, but here's the thing, even those people admit he still pulled it off. His natural bouncy comedic energy got twisted into something darker for this role. By the end of the film, Denham isn't funny at all. He's a cautionary tale about what happens when ego gets completely out of control. Jack Black brought that shift convincingly, and that ain't easy. Adrian Brody as Jack Driscoll. The unlikely hero next up is Adrian Brody, who plays Jack Driscoll, a playwright and screenwriter who accidentally ends up on the most dangerous adventure of his life. Driscoll falls hard for Anne Darrow during the voyage, and when she gets snatched by Kong on Skull Island, he ain't about to just sit back and do nothing. He leads the charge to go rescue her, even though he's literally just a writer, not a soldier. Not an action hero, just a dude who cares about the woman he loves. Brody was coming off his Oscar win for The Pianist 2002 when he stepped into this role, so all eyes were on him. Some viewers felt like Driscoll was a bit of an underwritten character compared to the movie's other big personalities, but Brody brought real grounded sincerity to the part. He made you root for a regular guy in an absolutely irregular situation. Brody's Driscoll is also notable for being the one person in the crew who actually agrees with Anne that Kong should be left alone and not brought back to New York City. He sees the bigger picture when everyone else is caught up in greed and spectacle. That moral clarity in the middle of all the chaos is actually a pretty cool character detail. Andy Serkis as Kong and Lumpy, the goat of motion capture. Okay, let's talk about the real MVP of this whole movie. Andy Serkis, the absolute king of motion capture performances, brought Kong to life in a way nobody had ever done before. And here's the wild part, Serkis wasn't just playing Kong, he also played Lumpy, the ship's cook, barber, and surgeon on the SS Venture. One dude, two roles, and one of those roles was a 25-foot tall prehistoric gorilla. Insane Serkis was cast as Kong back in April 2003, and from that moment on, he went fully method. He spent time working with gorillas at the London Zoo, studying how they move, how they carry themselves, how they communicate. Then he took a trip to Rwanda to observe gorillas in the wild. He wasn't playing pretend, he was straight up doing gorilla research like a scientist. Peter Jackson was crystal clear from the jump that he did not want Kong to behave like a human in a gorilla suit. That's what a lot of older monster movies got wrong. Jackson wanted Kong to feel like a real animal, specifically a real gorilla, with actual gorilla instincts and body language. Serkis and Jackson studied hours of gorilla footage together, and all of that research poured directly into the performance. The technical side of bringing Kong to life was also next level. Serkis had to go through 2 full hours of motion capture makeup every single day with 135 tiny markers attached all over his face to track every little expression. After principal photography wrapped up, he spent an extra 2 months on a motion capture stage acting out Kong's movements just for the digital animators to reference. That's commitment that most actors just don't have. Entertainment Weekly called Kong's CGI depiction the most convincing computer generated character in film as of 2005. That's a big deal. And Veta Digital's Christian Rivers, who supervised all aspects of Kong's performance, explained why Serkis's real face worked so well for the motion capture. Gorillas and humans have remarkably similar facial structures around the eyes and brows, which meant Serkis's real expressions translated beautifully onto Kong's digital face. Thomas Kretschmann as Captain Engelhorn. The German captain with good instincts, Thomas Kretschmann plays Captain Engelhorn, the no-nonsense German captain of the SS Venture, the ship that carries everyone to Skull Island. Engelhorn is one of those characters who clearly knows something is off about this whole situation but gets dragged along anyway. He's got a real dislike for Denham, which honestly makes total sense given how reckless and manipulative Denham is throughout the whole voyage. Kretschmann is a German actor who was already well known in European cinema before this role. His quiet, serious energy was perfect for Engelhorn, a captain who's professional and skeptical and ultimately gets proven right about all his doubts. Colin Hanks as Preston, the loyal assistant Colin Hanks. Yeah, Tom Hanks's kid plays Preston, Carl Denham's loyal assistant. Preston is basically the guy who helps Denham pull off all his schemes, even when he's clearly uncomfortable with how things are going. He's young, he's eager, and he gets caught up in Denham's world before fully understanding what that world costs people. Hanks brings a likable, relatable quality to Preston that makes him easy to sympathize with. Jamie Bell as Jimmy, the young sailor with something to prove. Jamie Bell, who blew everyone away as the kid in Billy Elliot back in 2000, plays Jimmy, a young sailor aboard the Venture who get caught up in all the madness on Skull Island. Jimmy is kind of a coming of age character in a movie that really didn't need one but got one anyway. Bell brings heart to the role and gives Jimmy a sense of innocence that makes the horror of Skull Island hit a little harder. Kyle Chandler as Bruce Baxter. The fake hero Kyle Chandler plays Bruce Baxter, a Hollywood actor who's been cast in Denham's film. Baxter is basically all swagger and no substance. The kind of guy who looks the part of a hero but bails when things get actually dangerous. Chandler plays this role with just the right amount of charm and cowardice, making Baxter one of the more entertaining side characters in the whole movie. Evan Park as Hayes, the voice of reason. Nobody listens to Evan Park plays Hayes, who is basically the sensible one on the whole ship. Hayes is experienced, sharp, and clearly aware that this whole expedition is a terrible idea. He looks out for Jimmy and tries to keep things together when everyone else is losing their minds. Park brings real dignity and strength to the role, making Hayes one of the more underrated characters in the film. The supporting crew, filling out the world, the SS Venture crew, featured a whole bunch of solid actors rounding out the world. Lobo Chan played Choi, one of the sailors. John Sumner played Herb, Denham's loyal cameraman who came all the way to Skull Island just to capture footage. Craig Hall played Mike, the soundman on the trip. William Johnson played Manny, an older vaudeville actor and colleague of Anne's. Mark Hadlow played Harry, another struggling vaudeville performer. Geraldine Brophy appeared as Maud on the more comedic and shady side. David Pitu played Weston, Jim Nobalock played a thuggish executive, and Rick Herbert played a sleazy executive. Those Hollywood suits who are always lurking in the background of stories like this, ready to exploit whatever they can. Jed Brophy, John Wright, Will Wallace, Frank Edwards, Crawford Thompson, Richard Kavanagh, Stephen Hall, and many more actors were part of the venture crew, filling the ship with real faces and real energy. Peter Jackson and friends, the cameos you might have missed. Peter Jackson himself showed up in the movie with Rick Baker, the makeup artist who actually played Kong in the 1976 remake, as the pilot and gunner on the airplane that ultimately kills Kong at the Empire State Building. That's a wild little meta moment right there. Jackson's kids appeared as New York children. Rick Porras, a Lord of the Rings producer, and Frank Darabont, the director of The Shawshank Redemption, both appeared as gunners in other planes during that climactic scene. Howard Shore, who was originally supposed to compose the film's score before creative differences led to his exit, made a cameo as the conductor at the New York theater where Kong escapes. These little Easter eggs and cameos add a layer of fun for film nerds who know what to look for. The Skull Island natives, a complicated choice. The native extras on Skull Island were portrayed by a mix of Asian, African, Maori, and Polynesian actors who were sprayed with dark makeup to create a consistent appearance across the group. This casting choice has been discussed and criticized over the years as it reflects a problematic approach to representing indigenous peoples that many modern filmmakers would handle very differently. It's worth noting, as part of the full picture of how this film was made, the big picture on the casting. When you look at this cast as a whole, what stands out is how seriously Peter Jackson took every single role. Watts, Black, and Brody were his first and only choices. No backup plans, no alternate lists. He saw exactly who these characters needed to be and went and got the right people for the job. Andy Serkis pushed the boundaries of what performance could mean in a digital age. Naomi Watts made you cry over a CGI gorilla. Jack Black made you genuinely uncomfortable watching a man destroy himself and everything around him chasing fame. Adrian Brody made you believe in a regular dude's love being worth fighting for against impossible odds. This was a stacked, thoughtful, carefully assembled ensemble for what was, at the time, the most expensive movie ever made, with a budget that climbed from an initial $150 million all the way up to a record breaking $207 million. And when it hit theaters on December 14, 2005, it made $50 million in its opening weekend alone, eventually pulling in $550 million worldwide. The casting of King Kong 2005 wasn't just about finding people who could say their lines. It was about finding people who could make you believe in a world where a giant prehistoric ape on top of the Empire State Building could break your heart. And somehow they actually pulled it off. Production, alright, let's get into it. The story of how King Kong 2005 actually got made is straight up wild. Like, it had more twists and false starts than the movie itself. To really understand how this thing came to life, you gotta go back to Peter Jackson's childhood. Homie was only 9 years old when he first caught the original 1933 King Kong on TV, and he literally cried when Kong got shot off the Empire State Building. That hit him deep. By the time he was 12, He was already trying to recreate the film using his parents' Super 8 camera. He built a little Kong model out of wire and rubber and used his mom's fur coat for the hair. He never finished it, but that obsession that never went away. King Kong became his all-time favorite film and the main reason he wanted to become a filmmaker in the first place. He read every book he could find about it, collected memorabilia, and hunted down articles from famous monsters of filmland. The guy was a legit superfan before that was even a term people used. Fast forward to 1996, and Jackson is in the middle of shooting The Frighteners for Universal Pictures. The studio was seriously impressed with his dailies and the early visual effects work he was putting out through Vita Digital and Vita Workshop. They were hyped to work with him on his next project, and they first came at him with an offer to direct a remake of Creature from the Black Lagoon. Jackson passed on that, but Universal caught wind of his King Kong obsession and came back swinging with an offer to direct that remake instead. At first, Jackson turned it down too, but then something gnawed at him. He got low-key freaked out by the idea that somebody else might grab it and make a trash version of one of his favorite films. So he eventually said yes to Universal. Now here's where it gets real complicated. At the same time, Jackson was tangled up with Harvey Weinstein and Miramax Films trying to lock down the rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Meanwhile, 20th Century Fox was trying to pull him in to direct the 2001 Planet of the Apes remake. Jackson said no to Planet of the Apes, and because Weinstein was dragging his feet on the Rings rights deal, Jackson decided to go full steam ahead with King Kong. Weinstein was mad about it, so Jackson came up with a deal where Universal and Miramax would split the financing 50-50 with his production company Wingwood Films in the mix. Universal would get US distribution rights and Miramax would handle the foreign territories. Not only that, but Jackson locked in the right of final cut, meaning nobody could mess with his vision, plus a percentage of gross profits and full artistic control. Universal even let him film everything and handle all the visual effects entirely in New Zealand. That deal was locked in April 1996. So Jackson and his wife and creative partner Fran Walsh got to work on the script. Their original draft was pretty different from what eventually hit the big screen. In that early version, Anne Darrow wasn't a vaudeville performer. She was the daughter of a famous English archaeologist named Lord Linwood Darrow, and they were out in Sumatra digging through ancient ruins. They'd run into Carl Denham and his crew, discover a hidden Kong statue, and find the map to Skull Island. The script also suggested that the island's natives were the last remnants of some ancient Asian mainland cult religion, and Jack Driscoll, he wasn't a playwright or even a screenwriter in that version. Dude was the first mate on the ship and a World War One fighter pilot still dealing with the grief of losing his best buddy in battle. The character of Herb the cameraman was the only supporting player from that original draft who made it all the way to the final movie. Universal signed off on the script and brought Robert Zemeckis on as executive producer. Pre-production started cranking. They were planning to begin filming sometime in 1997 with a summer 1998 release. Vita Digital and Vita Workshop under Richard Taylor and Christian Rivers started on early visual effects tests, specifically trying to build a CGI version of New York City circa 1933, which was no small task. Jackson and Walsh pushed into a second draft. Sets were being designed, and location scouting kicked off in both Sumatra and New Zealand. In late 1996, Jackson even flew out to Mexico where Titanic was being filmed to have a conversation with Kate Winslet, someone he'd worked with on Heavenly Creatures, about the role of Anne Darrow. Minnie Driver was also reportedly being looked at for the role. For Jack Driscoll and Carl Denham, Jackson had names like George Clooney and Robert De Niro in his head. But then January 1997 happened and everything slammed to a halt. Universal started sweating over the monster movie landscape. The 1998 Godzilla reboot was coming, Mighty Joe Young was on deck, and Planet of the Apes was in development. The studio didn't want to risk flooding the market with ape and monster flicks, so they pulled the plug on King Kong in February 1997. Weta Workshop and Weta Digital had already burned 6 months of pre-production work. It was a gut punch. Jackson shelved Kong and pivoted to a little film you might have heard of, The Lord of the Rings. Then came the comeback. The Fellowship of the Ring dropped in 2001 and absolutely crushed it at the box office. The Two Towers followed in 2002 and did the same. Universal looked at these numbers, looked at Jackson, and came knocking again in early 2003. During the post-production of The Return of the King, they reopened the King Kong conversation. In March 2003, Universal locked in a December 2005 target release date. Jackson got his Lord of the Rings co-writer Philippa Boyens on board to help rewrite the script alongside himself and Walsh. He offered New Line Cinema a chance to co-finance, but they passed. The original projected budget was 150 million less, which grew to 175 million less during early planning. Jackson's deal with Universal this time was substantial. He was getting a $20 million salary against 20% of the box office gross for directing, producing, and co-writing. He split that fee with Walsh and Boyens. But there was a catch. If the film went over its $175 million budget, Jackson himself would have to cover the overage. Spoiler alert, it went over. Way over. Right after wrapping The Return of the King, the whole Weta machine fired back up for Kong. Jackson brought back most of his Rings crew, cinematographer Andrew Lesnie, production designer Grant Major, art director Simon Bright and Dan Hanna, conceptual designer Alan Lee, and editor Jamie Selkirk. Jackson, Walsh, and Boyan started fresh on the new screenplay in late October 2003. Jackson had been real candid that the 1996 script was not great. He described it as just Walsh and him hurriedly putting something down on paper. Boyens explained it was more like one of many possible directions the story could go. So, for this version, they went back to the 1933 film as their foundation rather than leaning on that earlier draft. The writers also pulled in material from the original 1933 screenplay by James Ashmore Creelman, specifically scenes that had been cut or never made it into the original film. One legendary example, the sequence where Kong shakes sailors off a log into a ravine. In the original, directors Marion Cooper and Ernest Sosak had planned to show giant spiders crawling out of the rocks to devour those sailors, but it got cut before release. Jackson not only brought it back, he went bigger with it. Beyond that, they drew on Delos W. Lovelace's 1932 novelization of King Kong, which introduced the character of Lumpy, the ship's cook, later played by Andy Serkis in a dual role. Jackson also got the rights to Early Havoc, a memoir by vaudeville performer June Havoc, which helped Walsh and Boyens flesh out Anne Darrow's backstory and personality. Carl Denham was deliberately written as an Orson Welles type, reckless, charismatic, willing to blow past every ethical line for his art. The new draft was done by February 2004, and principal photography was set to kick off on September 6th of that same year. The cast came together pretty clean. Naomi Watts, Jack Black, and Adrian Brody were Peter Jackson's first and only choices for their respective roles. He never considered anyone else for those three parts. Watts even met with Fay Ray, the original Anne Darrow from the 1933 film, to prepare for the role. Jackson had actually wanted Ray to appear in the film for a brief cameo, specifically to deliver the movie's final line. She initially wasn't feeling it, but then seemed to warm up to the idea. Tragically, she passed away during pre-production at 96 years old, so that never happened. Jack Black was cast based on his performance in High Fidelity, which had blown Jackson away. For his prep work on Carl Denham, Black studied P.T. Barnum and Orson Welles, soaking up the vibe of that kind of reckless, larger than life showman personality. Andy Serkis, who was already a legend after playing Gollum in the Rings trilogy, got cast as Kong in April 2003. To get ready, he went to the London Zoo to work directly with gorillas, then traveled to Rwanda to observe them in the wild. Thomas Kretschmann came aboard as Captain Englehorn, Colin Hanks as Preston, Jamie Bell as Jimmy, Evan Park as Hayes, and Kyle Chandler as Bruce Baxter. The native extras for the Skull Island sequences were a mix of Asian, African, Maori, and Polynesian actors who were given dark makeup to create a consistent look across the group. Filming principal photography officially kicked off on September 6, 2004 at Camperdown Studios in Miramar, New Zealand, and this is where things started getting really intense. The production was massive. Camperdown Studios housed the native village set and the Great Wall of Skull Island, while the 1930s New York City streets were built out on the studio backlot and at a location in Gracefield, Lower Hutt. The SS Venture, the ship that carries everybody to Skull Island, was shot on a full-scale deck set built in the parking lot at Camperdown, all backed up against a huge green screen with the ocean dropped in digitally during post. The Broadway theater sequences where Kong goes full on rampage mode were filmed at Wellington's Opera House and the Auckland Civic Theatre. On top of all that, a brand new soundstage was built at Stone Street Studios specifically to fit one of the larger set pieces. The whole motion capture work for Kong was one of the most technically demanding parts of the entire shoot. Jackson saw this film as a big opportunity to push motion capture technology into new territory. He tapped Christian Rivers of Weta Digital to oversee everything about Kong's performance. Jackson was super clear from the jump that he did not want Kong to act like a human. He and his team spent hours studying gorilla footage to get the movements, the physicality, and the behavior right. Silverback mountain gorilla photos were literally overlaid onto Kong's image in the early stages of animation to nail that visual. Serkis had a brutal daily routine during production. Every single day he'd spend 2 hours getting into motion capture makeup. That meant 135 tiny markers being attached to specific points all over his face. The level of facial detail captured was insane, and it worked because, as Rivers explained, gorillas and humans have a similar enough facial structure that you can read real emotion in those expressions. The detailed similarities between human and gorilla eyes and brows meant that Sarkozy's actual performance could come through in Kong's face in a way that felt totally believable. After principal photography wrapped, Serkis spent another 2 months on a dedicated motion capture stage, going through every single one of Kong's movements frame by frame for the digital animators to work from. The guy basically played two characters in the film, Kong, obviously, but also Lumpy the ship's cook, and he killed it on both fronts. Skull Island itself was populated with all kinds of prehistoric creatures beyond just Kong. The design team, inspired by scientist and author Dougal Dixon's speculative biology work, asked themselves a serious question: what would happen to dinosaurs and other creatures if they'd been isolated on an island and evolving independently for 65 million years or more? That framing gave them permission to create these amazing hybrid creatures, things that look familiar but are twisted by millions of years of weird isolated evolution. The dinosaurs in the film weren't just reskinned Jurassic Park animals, they were their own species given scientific sounding names with behaviors developed through real thought about ecology and predator prey dynamics. The budget situation during filming was already starting to spiral. The original budget had been $175 million, but as production rolled forward, the costs kept climbing. There were additional visual effects requirements that nobody had fully anticipated, and Jackson made the call to extend the film's running time by about 30 minutes, which meant more scenes, more VFX work, more everything. The budget eventually ballooned from $175 million to $207 million, a $32 million overage. And per his deal with Universal, Jackson covered most of that extra $32 million himself. That's the kind of all in commitment this guy had to this project. Universal had agreed to let the budget get that large only after their executives flew to New Zealand to watch a screening of the unfinished film, and they came away so hyped about what they saw that they greenlit the expanded budget and the longer runtime. The marketing campaign launched officially on June 27, 2005, while filming was still wrapping up. The teaser trailer dropped online first through the Volkswagen website at 8:45 p.m. EDT, then hit across all the NBC Universal Media properties NBC, Bravo, CNBC, MSNBC at 8:55 p.m. EDT. The trailer then got attached to War of the Worlds in theaters starting June 29th. Jackson also launched a series of production diaries that he put out online. These were edited into short, broadband friendly clips of 3 or 4 minutes each, giving fans a real behind the scenes look at what was going down. Tours of the sets, introductions to key crew members, peeks at the sound booth, footage of Andy Serkis doing his gorilla movements in the motion capture studio. It was a smart and genuine way to keep the audience engaged during production. Filming wrapped in March 2005. Post production on King Kong was no joke, and honestly, some of the most dramatic stuff happened in this phase. Let's talk about the elephant or gorilla in the room first, the composer situation. Howard Shore, who had written the legendary scores for all three Lord of the Rings films, was originally set to do the music for King Kong 2. He'd already written several cues for the film. But then in October 2005, just 7 weeks before the film was set to open, Jackson and Shore had a falling out over creative differences and Shore walked off the project. This was a huge deal. 7 weeks is basically nothing when you're trying to score a 187-minute epic film. James Newton Howard stepped in as the replacement. The man was a seasoned pro, but even he admitted that this was the hardest film he'd ever had to compose for. With scoring not starting until late October 2005, Howard had roughly 5 weeks to create music for a nearly 3 hour monster blockbuster. Recording sessions went down at the Sony Scoring Stage in California and Todd AO in Los Angeles. Howard worked with a 108-piece orchestra and a 40-member choir, pulling in a wide variety of instruments to build out the sound. Despite the insane time crunch, Howard delivered. and his score was later nominated for the Golden Globe Award for Best Original Score. The film's soundtrack also incorporated some iconic period pieces. Al Jolson's recording of I'm Sitting on Top of the World, Peggy Lee's Bye Bye Blackbird, and some themes pulled straight from Max Steiner's original score for the 1933 King Kong. Those Max Steiner inclusions were a deliberate nod to the original, and they hit different when you know the history. The score was released on December 7, 2005 by Decca Records and got a positive response from critics and fans. On the visual effects side, the post-production work was absolutely enormous. Vita Digital had been grinding on Kong's CGI from the earliest stages of pre-production, but the real finessing happened in post. The digital animators used all of Andy Serkis's motion capture data as their foundation and built Kong's performance outward from there, adding layers of detail, texture, weight, and personality. Kong's design, a silverbackish prehistoric ape around 25 feet tall, somewhere between 100 and 150 years old, the last of his species, had to read as both terrifyingly powerful and emotionally compelling. The filmmakers wanted audiences to feel something real for this creature, and that required a performance level from the VFX work that went way beyond just big scary monster. The CGI New York City of the 1930s was another massive undertaking. The team had to build a digital version of the city that felt authentic to that era, with period accurate buildings, streets, vehicles, and crowds. The Empire State Building climax required Kong to be convincing at extreme heights with real weight and physical believability, and the six Navy biplanes attacking him had to feel genuinely dangerous and grounded. The fight between Kong and the three Vastatosaurus Rexes, those Rex like dinosaurs on Skull Island, was another huge visual effects achievement. The animators studied the original Kong vs. T. Rex fight from 1933 closely and made their version feel like a loving but vastly upgraded tribute, with the Kong's moves in the final Vastatosaurus battle being almost beat for beat what the 1933 version had, including Kong playing with the broken jaw of the downed dino before standing up and beating his chest. One interesting detail about the post-production period: Jackson has talked about wanting to remaster the film in 3D at some point in the future. He was even shooting some footage with a 3D camera during the production itself, experimenting with the technology. That 3D remaster never officially happened, but it speaks to how much Jackson still thinks about this movie and how he wants people to experience it. The theatrical runtime that emerged from all this work landed at 187 minutes, 3 hours and 7 minutes. The original target had been a much leaner 135 minutes, but the runtime kept expanding as Jackson kept adding and refining. Universal executives flew to New Zealand to watch a rough cut of the extended version and came back convinced it was worth it. The marketing and promotion budget added another estimated $60 million on top of the $207 million production cost. This was truly a no expense spared situation. The film came loaded with fun Easter eggs and callbacks to the 1933 original and Jackson's own filmography. In one of the hold scenes, you can spot a crate marked Sumatran rat monkey. Beware the bite. That's a direct nod to the creature at the center of Jackson's 1992 cult horror comedy Braindead. Jimmy reads from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness on the voyage to Skull Island, drawing a parallel between their journey and the novel's themes of darkness and moral dissent. The movie even includes a clever meta reference. Early in the film, Carl Denham is trying to cast his leading lady and suggests Faye for the role. to which his assistant Preston replies that Faye is busy doing a picture with RKO. Music from the 1933 film plays. Denham mutters, Cooper, huh? I might have known. That's a direct wink at Fay Wray and director Marion C. Cooper from the original film. The line, "It wasn't the airplanes, it was Beauty Killed the Beast," also comes back just as it did in the original, delivered by Carl Denham as the final word on Kong's fate. Kong's Broadway appearance in the film was also designed to visually mirror the sacrifice scene from the 1933 original, with similar costuming on the dancers and similar blackface makeup, a deliberate visual echo that Jackson and his team built in as a callback, though it did attract some criticism in reviews about the retention of those racial imagery elements. Relay King Kong had its world premiere in New York City on December 5, 2005, a giant-sized event in every sense. The film then got a theatrical release in New Zealand on December 13, 2005, and opened wide in the United States on December 14, 2005. It was a big deal release calendar-wise, dropping right in the middle of the holiday season, which is prime real estate for blockbusters. Universal went hard on marketing. The teaser trailer rollout back in June had already built serious buzz, and the production diaries Jackson had been putting out online had kept fans engaged and hyped throughout the whole filmmaking process. The multi-platform approach to marketing was forward-thinking for 2005, dropping content online, tying it to NBC Universal's TV networks, and attaching the trailer to a major summer blockbuster like War of the Worlds to reach a massive in-theater audience. The release was accompanied by a bunch of tie-in material. There was a novelization of the film, a prequel novel called King Kong, The Island of the Skull, and a multi-platform video game, Peter Jackson's King Kong, that ended up being both a commercial and critical success in its own right. Vita Workshop put out a gorgeous hardback book called The World of Kong, a natural history of Skull Island, which featured detailed artwork describing all the fictional wildlife of Skull Island. That book was a collector's item for fans and went deep on the evolutionary backstory of every creature in the film. Home video release came on March 28, 2006 in the United States and Canada through Universal Studios Home Entertainment. They put out both a single disc widescreen edition and a two-disc widescreen special edition. Then on November 14, 2006, a 3-disc deluxe extended edition dropped in the US. This version reinserted 12 minutes of footage back into the film and included an additional 40 minutes of special features. The extended cut runs a full 200 minutes. That edition came with commentary from Peter Jackson and Philippa Boyens spread across the first two discs, and the main special features packed onto disc 3. There was also a special collector's set that included a Vita Workshop figurine of a battle-damaged Kong climbing the Empire State Building with Anne in hand. The film also got an HD DVD release as part of a promotional bundle with the external HD DVD drive for the Xbox 360. Later, on January 20, 2009, both the theatrical and extended cuts were released together on Blu-ray disc. And in February 2017, a Ultimate Edition Blu-ray dropped with a bonus disc pulling together nearly all the extras from the previous DVD and Blu-ray releases. An Ultra HD Blu-ray followed in July 2017, keeping the film available in the best possible quality as home video technology kept evolving. On the theme park side, Universal Orlando's Islands of Adventure eventually built an attraction called Skull Island: Reign of Kong, directly inspired by Jackson's remake. Over at Universal Studios Hollywood, the original King Kong attraction was destroyed in a major fire, but a new 3D short King Kong 360 3D was created in 2010 as a replacement, also based on Jackson's version of the story. Kong's cultural footprint just kept expanding. There was also a brief period where a sequel seemed possible. In March 2021, director Adam Wingard revealed that back in 2013, Jackson had been interested in producing a sequel to the film, tentatively called Skull Island, with Wingard directing and Simon Barrett writing. Jackson had been impressed by Wingard's horror film You're Next and was exploring that potential collaboration. But by 2013, the rights had already transferred to Warner Brothers, making a sequel to a Universal produced film legally complicated. Wingard had even pitched a World War I era prequel concept, but the studio wasn't interested in that setting. A modern day sequel pitch also went nowhere. Ultimately, Warner Bros. Rebooted the franchise with Kong Skull Island in 2017, which launched the Monsterverse and took the character in a whole different direction. Reception when King Kong finally hit theaters in December 2005, the reception was genuinely strong, with a few caveats that critics and audiences were pretty open about. The film landed on top 10 list for the year from multiple critics, and it swept up major award nominations and wins. But let's talk about what audiences actually thought when they walked out of those theaters. The general vibe from people who saw it was that this was a spectacular, emotional, visually stunning achievement, but man, it was long. At 3 hours and 7 minutes, even some of the biggest fans of the movie admitted that there were stretches where you started feeling the runtime. The Skull Island section of the film especially got some pushback for going on too long with its creature attacks and jungle mayhem. People who loved it absolutely loved it, but it wasn't the kind of film you could coast through passively. You had to be locked in. Cinema Score, which surveys actual moviegoers on opening night, gave the film an A minus, a solid grade that suggested audiences were genuinely satisfied, even if it wasn't quite a perfect crowd pleaser. That A minus reflects a film that delivered on its ambitions without quite being a universal crowd pleaser in the way a simpler summer blockbuster might be. It was big, ambitious, emotional, and demanding of its audience's time and attention. The DVD sales numbers told their own story about how much people at home loved this movie. When the DVD dropped in March 2006, it generated over $100 million in sales in its first 6 days, the biggest 6 day DVD performance in Universal Studios history up to that point. Ultimately, the film sold more than 6 million DVDs in North America, accumulating nearly $194 million in North American DVD sales alone. By late June 2006, DVD rental revenue had already hit nearly $38 million. That's not the performance of a film people saw and forgot about. That's a film people wanted to own and rewatch. In February 2006, Turner Broadcasting System TNT TBS and ABC paid Universal Pictures 26.5 for the television rights to the film. Networks paying that kind of money are doing it because they're confident in the ratings draw, and King Kong clearly had that. The award circuit was good to the film too. It received 4 Academy Award nominations: Best Visual Effects, Best Sound Mixing, Best Sound Editing, and Best Production Design. It walked away with 3 of those 4 wins: Best Visual Effects, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Sound Editing. The only one it missed was Production Design. Those technical wins were a reflection of how genuinely groundbreaking the film's craftsmanship was recognized to be within the industry. Box office, let's talk money because this is where things got real interesting real fast. King Kong opened on a Wednesday, December 14, 2005 and brought in $9.8 million on that first day. Over its first full weekend, it pulled in $50.1 million, giving it a 5-day opening total of $66.2 million across roughly 7,500 screens at 3,568 theaters across North America. Now, here's the thing, some analysts called those opening numbers disappointing. Studio executives had reportedly been expecting bigger. When you've got a $207 million production budget plus an estimated $60 million in marketing costs, you're looking at a film that needs to perform huge just to break even, and $66 million in 5 days, while solid for most movies, wasn't the jaw dropping world record opening that Universal had been dreaming about. The conversation in Hollywood trade publications that first weekend was a mix of "this is fine" and "we thought it'd be bigger." The runtime was a factor. At 187 minutes, you simply can't pack as many screenings into a day as you can with a 90 or 110-minute film, which limits the ceiling on daily gross regardless of demand. But here's the key thing, King Kong had legs. It kept performing week over week in a way that more front loaded blockbusters often don't. Word of mouth was strong, critical support was strong, and families and moviegoers kept turning up through the holidays and into January. In North America, the film ultimately grossed $218.1 million, landing it in the top 5 highest grossing films of 2005 in the domestic market. That's a genuine win. Internationally, the film crushed even harder. The overseas box office added another $338.8 million, giving King Kong a worldwide total of $556.9 million. That number made it the fifth highest grossing film worldwide in 2005, and at the time it ranked as the fourth highest grossing film in Universal Pictures history overall. Given that the budget had ballooned to $207 million and marketing added another $60 million, the worldwide theatrical gross was what made this film a genuine financial success rather than a costly stumble. The film was officially the most expensive film ever made at the time of its release, with that $207 million production budget setting a new record. That record would eventually be surpassed by other productions in the years to come, but in December 2005, King Kong was literally the biggest budget film ever put on screen up to that point. The fact that it ended up grossing nearly $557 million worldwide meant Universal made their money back and then some, though the profit margins on a film this expensive are always tighter than they look from the outside when you factor in all the costs. The home video performance, as mentioned earlier, was exceptional. The $100 million in DVD sales in the first 6 days was a record for Universal, and the eventual $194 million in North American DVD sales plus the $38 million in rental revenue added significant dollars to the film's total financial picture. The $26. 5 million TV rights deal with Turner Broadcasting and ABC was another healthy revenue stream. When you add all of it up, theatrical home video rentals, TV rights, King Kong was a major financial success for Universal despite the bloated budget for a film that some analysts had called a disappointment based on that first weekend. The final numbers told a very different story. It was not the record breaking phenomenon that some people had dreamed it might be, but it was absolutely a profitable, successful blockbuster that performed well across multiple revenue streams and proved that there was a real global audience for Peter Jackson's vision of this story. Critical response, the critics, for the most part, got it. King Kong 2005 landed an 84% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on 266 reviews, with an average rating of 7.7 out of 10. The site's critical consensus described it as a potent epic with state-of-the-art special effects, terrific performances, and a majestic sense of spectacle that stays faithful to the spirit of the 1933 original. On Metacritic, the film pulled an 81 out of 100 based on 39 critics. That's in universal acclaim territory, which is a big deal. These are genuinely strong numbers for a nearly 3-hour blockbuster remake. Roger Ebert, one of the most influential film critics in America, gave King Kong 4 stars, his highest rating, and included it on his best 10 films of 2005 list, placing it at number 8. When Ebert gives something 4 stars, that means something. He was a tough critic who didn't throw that rating around lightly, and his enthusiasm for the film was a significant stamp of approval from the critical establishment. Entertainment Weekly called Kong the most convincing computer generated character in film in 2005. That's a big statement when you consider what was coming out at that time, and it speaks to how much Veta Digital's work elevated what audiences and industry pros thought was possible with CGI characters. The combination of Andy Serkis's performance capture and the animator's work created something that genuinely felt alive. The Guardian's Peter Bradshaw wrote that the film matched and possibly exceeded everything Jackson had pulled off in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That's some high praise coming from a serious film critic. In 2008, Empire magazine ranked King Kong 450th on their list of the 500 greatest movies of all time. Not the very top of the list, but a legitimate spot on a very prestigious ranking. Not everyone was all the way on board though. Charlie Brooker, also writing for The Guardian, went in the complete opposite direction with a negative review, calling the film massively overblown and overcooked. He described it as many times more histrionic than it needed to be. Some critics took specific aim at the runtime, arguing that Jackson had the freedom to tighten things up but didn't, and that the film's midsection especially drags in ways that test the patience of even enthusiastic viewers. That criticism was fair, and it showed up across enough reviews that it can't be dismissed as just one person's opinion. There was also critical discussion about the racial imagery in the film, particularly around the native Skull Island characters and the Broadway spectacle sequence. Several reviewers pointed out that the film retained racial stereotypes from the 1933 original, the dark-skinned savages, the primitive tribal behavior, the optics of King Kong as a story that can be read through a very specific colonial lens without meaningfully interrogating or updating those elements. It was generally acknowledged that Jackson hadn't done this intentionally, but the conversation about representation and racial imagery in the film was real and legitimate. Kwame Mackenzie, writing for Times Online, called out the stereotyping directly, and academic analysis of the film has engaged with these questions in depth. The Jimmy character reading Heart of Darkness on the voyage to Skull Island was noted by some as an invitation to think about those colonial themes, though whether the film followed through on that invitation was debated. On the positive side, the performances got a lot of love. Naomi Watts was praised for making Anne Darrow feel like a real full person rather than just a classic scream queen, and her physical commitment to the role, including all the green screen work where she had to act against nothing while pretending to be held by a 25-foot gorilla, was genuinely impressive. Jack Black's Carl Denham worked because Black found the right balance between likable showman energy and genuine moral rot. Adrian Brody's Jack Driscoll was sometimes seen as the thinnest of the three leads, but he anchored the human emotional stakes effectively, and Andy Serkis, through Kong, delivered what many called the performance of the film, a physically and emotionally complex portrayal of a creature who becomes completely sympathetic even as he's terrifying. The film won three Academy Awards: Best Visual Effects, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Sound Editing out of four nominations. Those wins were genuinely deserved. The visual effects work, specifically Kong himself and the integration of the CGI creatures into practical environments, was the best that had ever been put on screen up to that point. The sound design contributed enormously to Kong's presence. You believed in him partly because he sounded real, from the subwoofer shaking weight of his footsteps to the emotional range in his vocalizations. The fourth nomination was for Best Production Design, recognizing the extraordinary work of Grant Major and his team in building the 1930s New York City streets, the Skull Island environments, and all the other visual worlds in the film. Losing that one, particularly in a year with strong competition, was the only Oscar category where the film came up short. James Newton Howard's score received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Original Score, which was a remarkable achievement given that he had only about 5 weeks to write and record the entire thing. The score wasn't as iconic or thematically memorable as what Shore had done for Rings, but it was a genuinely effective piece of work that served the film well and did so under nearly impossible time constraints. The film appeared on numerous critics' top 10 lists for 2005, cementing its place not just as a successful blockbuster but as one of the year's most talked about and respected films. In a year that also included films like Munich, Brokeback a Mountain, Good Night and Good Luck, and Crash, the Best Picture winner, King Kong held its own in the cultural conversation, even if it wasn't primarily operating in the award season prestige drama lane. Looking back from the perspective of more than 20 years later, King Kong 2005 occupies an interesting place in film history. It was a technical milestone, a genuine labor of love from a filmmaker who had been obsessed with this material since childhood, and a film that at its best achieved something emotionally meaningful with a character that could easily have been just a CGI spectacle attraction. The scene of Kong and Anne watching the sunset from the top of the Empire State Building, just the two of them, sharing a quiet moment of beauty before everything goes wrong, is genuinely moving. That's hard to pull off in a monster movie, and Jackson pulled it off. At its worst, it was too long, too indulgent, too willing to let the Skull Island section run on past the point of necessity. The pacing was a real issue that even fans acknowledged. But the ambition, the craft, the love for, for the source material, and the groundbreaking technical achievement all add up to something that earned its place in the conversation about great blockbuster filmmaking. It was the most expensive movie ever made at the time, and while it maybe didn't produce the kind of returns that would have made the studio executives pump their fists in pure triumph, it succeeded commercially, critically, and artistically in ways that few films at that scale ever managed to do. Peter Jackson got to make his King Kong, not the hasty version he almost threw together in 1997 before the project got killed, but the real one, the full, no holds barred $207 million version that he'd been dreaming about since he was a 9-year-old kid crying in front of his family's television. And whether you think it needed to be 3 hours long or not, you can't front on the achievement. This movie went for it in every department, and it shows reviews and facts. Number one, giant ape meets girl. Giant ape loses girl. Giant ape goes ballistic and escorts girl to the top of New York's tallest skyscraper. It's a familiar love story that gets a few new twists, including a dose of tenderness in Peter Jackson's rollicking 3 hour extravaganza King Kong. Inspired by the 1933 original, the movie that lit a filmmaking fire in Jackson's belly at age 9, as opposed to the 1976 update that didn't ignite much of anything. The story opens with snapshot of Depression-era New York City, shanty towns, soup lines, vaudeville shows. In fact, that's where we find lovely company player Anne Darrow giving him the old razzle dazzle in a theater about to succumb to hard times. Meanwhile, cinematic snake oil salesman Carl Denham is desperate to get a movie made that will satisfy the angry investors he's been stringing along. He's heard rumors of a mysterious island that could provide the very spectacle he needs. Pressured to weigh anchor, he discovers the down and out Anne and convinces her to be his leading lady. Carl also manipulates his reluctant screenwriter, respected playwright Jack Driscoll, into making the journey. Jack and Anne hit it off, unaware that a ferocious 8,000 pound silverback will turn their blossoming romance into a rather awkward love triangle. When the excessively creepy natives of Skull Island sacrifice Anne as a kicking, screaming hors d'oeuvre to their hairy, chest thumping god, the ship's crew rushes into the jungle to rescue her, though it's obvious Carl's top priority is capturing the prehistoric setting on film. The search party encounters dinosaurs, enormous bugs, vicious bats, and of course a cranky monkey who comes to appreciate Anne as more than just a late night snack. He's smitten. So Anne and Kong open a nice little bed and break fast to give those uptight natives a place to unwind and play racquetball. Okay, I made up that last part. Actually, what's left of the decimated rescue team orchestrates Kong's capture so that Carl can put him on display in the big city. All goes as planned until the beast creates chaos in his search for beauty Pazi element son and a fatherly actor friend look after one another, each concerned that the other is eating well. He reminds Anne of her value and urges her to chase dreams. The first mate, Hayes, is a father figure to a sailor he found as a young boy and has been mentoring ever since. Carl, Carl pays Anne's debt when she's caught pilfering fruit and proceeds to buy her a meal. He's clearly hoping for a return on that investment, but it's still a kind act. Although he's mousy and often lacks the courage of his convictions, Carl's assistant, Preston, acts as his boss's conscience. Once in the jungle, men leap to one another's aid. Jack risks life and limb on several occasions to rescue Anne. A narcissistic movie star prone to cowardice turns a corner and behaves heroically. The softening of Kong's heart and Anne's increased respect for this jungle king illustrate the power of friendship even between species. No passive damsel in distress, Anne is a strong woman who teaches Kong the meaning of beauty and pleads for the men not to hurt him. While unemployed, she resists the temptation to take work with his sleazy burlesque show. As a fish out of water story, King Kong implies that what one creature calls home can be a hostile, dangerous place to another, be it the jungle or the city. The movie promotes mutual understanding as it cautions mankind not to destroy the very things that fascinate us. Director Peter Jackson told USA Today, "You realize that human beings always end up destroying the things that are mysterious and wonderful in our world. We can't help but muck it up. Spiritual elements saved from certain death, a man utters, thank God, only to have the ship's captain credit human initiative instead. Don't thank God. Thank Mr. Baxter. The heavily pierced inhabitants of Skull Island come across as possessed savages under the influence of the occult, more than just drum beating, Kong worshipping followers of some quirky witch doctor. These are oppressively dark, vicious, zombie like natives. Many walk around with their eyes rolled back in their heads. To appease Kong, they conduct human sacrifices. Sexual and romantic content desperate for work, and stands in front of a burlesque theater plastered with signs reading adults only and photos of immodestly dressed women. To her credit, she walks away and is ready to do the same when she misinterprets a proposition by Carl as having sexual strings attached. Jack and Anne kiss passionately. One of Carl's investors wants to know if the director's upcoming film will feature jiggling breasts, causing Carl to call the man a low-life for even asking such a question. A stage comedy features a man in drag, context unclear. Violent content Anne gets shaken up a lot when grabbed, carried, and later rescued by Kong. The ape playfully knocks her around until she tells him to stop. People are attacked by prehistoric creatures from giant mosquitoes to hungry lizards. On the island, Kong battles three T-Rexes, biting the tongue out of one and breaking its jaw, a swarm of bats, and men wielding machine guns, harpoons, and knockout gas during his unveiling of Kong in New York. Carl tells the crowd that the mission claimed the lives of 17 men, an understatement. A guy gets speared by natives. Another has his head chopped off out of frame. A fate also about to befall Carl until members of the ship's crew start firing guns at the locals and kill at least one. Other doomed characters are crushed, thrown and or bitten in two by the great ape, squashed or munched by dinos, knocked off a crumbling cliff, shaken from a log into a vast cavern, eaten alive by giant fanged worms, and snatched out of the air like a bug by a mysterious creature. Just the attempt to subdue Kong finds him wildly swiping his arms, sending 4 or 5 screaming guys flying into the air. He smashes a rowboat, dispatching several more. Kong's tempestuous visit to Manhattan yields all sorts of property damage. Cars wreck, buildings crumble, a theater gets demolished. Kong tosses city folk aside as if they were rag dolls, sometimes with fatal force. He stomps a man to death. He assaults a trolley car. Pilots train their machine guns on him. Before the agile ape destroys several biplanes, the military uses heavy artillery to try to bring him down, causing collateral damage. A bullet-riddled Kong plummets from atop the Empire State Building. The ship's cook tells the story of a man who ended up with a knife in his heart. We also see the residue of violence with lots of human skulls, rotting remains, and impaled skeletons. A crewman is found dead in his cabin in a pool of blood. The boat and its passengers are battered violently by waves and rocks. Exclamatory profanities range from mild N to blasphemous. 6 uses of Gideon, several for God's sake, and a dozen abuses of Christ's name. Very disappointing. A person is called a turd, and Carl boasts, I'm real good at crapping the crappers. A man fires off a laundry list of slang terms for women's breasts. Carl calms his nerves with alcohol on several occasions. Typical of films set in the 1930s, many characters smoke cigarettes. Others puff cigars. Carl prepares a pipe. Ample amounts of chloroform are used to bring down Kong. Other noteworthy elements: Carl is more scurrilous and by the end less likable than in the original Kong. With an Ahab-like obsession, he values the film he is making above human life. While those misplaced priorities aren't treated as noble, this lying, scheming opportunist escapes consequences. Giant bugs, including a millipede that cozies up to and may gross out some viewers. A sympathetic young man also happens to be a vandal and petty thief. Conclusion: as kids growing up in the New York metropolitan area during the 1970s, my brother and I enjoyed a unique Thanksgiving Day tradition that had nothing to do with football or the Macy's parade. Every year, a local TV station would broadcast King Kong, Son of Kong, and Mighty Joe Young in that order, back to back. Since those were the days before video rentals, that annual Monkey Fest was as much a part of our holiday as turkey and pumpkin pie. Why do I mention this? To give you some idea of how much I wanted to love this movie and how disappointed I was by its excesses, specifically demonic natives, abuses of Christ's name, and realistic fatalities that, in Peter Jackson's attempt to be shockingly cool, often come across as perversely self indulgent. Consider that a scene featuring man-eating spiders was cut from the original Kong after members of a preview audience literally lost their lunch. It went too far. So someone at the helm back in 1933 vied for restraint. That was then. This is now. Jackson loved the notion of crewmen surviving the fall from a log into a chasm only to encounter jumbo bugs with a supersized appetite. Newsweek's Devin Gordon wrote, before he won a raft of Oscars for The Lord of the Rings, before he stunned the art house crowd with the 1994 drama Heavenly Creatures, Peter Jackson, New Zealand's favorite son, directed a series of demented low budget horror films that seemed designed to make people barf repeatedly. For Jackson, one of the biggest perks of recreating Kong was the chance to do his own spider pit scene. And what Peter wants, Peter gets. Make no mistake, King Kong is an amazing remake. It looks great. And once it kicks into high gear, it maintains a breakneck pace. Supporting characters are colorfully drawn so that we care when they are in danger, and the bond between Anne and Kong is unusually sweet. Even if their mutual attraction strays toward silliness near the end, the relationship has heart. That's due in part to delightful subtleties in Kong's personality, brought to life by actor Andy Serkis and state-of-the-art computer wizardry. The Academy might as well give Richard Taylor's effects team the Oscar right now, if only for Kong's rampage through Manhattan and the brilliantly choreographed T-Rex battle. King Kong will certainly sell lots of popcorn. It will also cement Jackson's status as a 21st century Steven Spielberg, a master at creating heartfelt, effects filled blockbusters at a time when being there seen that audiences aren't easily impressed. But what would have made this escapist adventure even better is a little old fashioned restraint. Number two, when it's good, it's very good, but when it's not, it feels really, really long. Watching Peter Jackson's version of King Kong, it is abundantly clear that the man feels as strongly about the original 1933 film as he did about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books. One can really feel how earnestly he guided this film, paying homage to the original while expanding on it more than just a little bit. Unfortunately, the expansion is one of the problems with the movie, but I'll get to that in a bit. I don't suppose I really need to go into the story itself, but there are a few changes from and additions to this version when compared to the 1933 film. Here, Anne Darrow, Naomi Watts, is shown to be a stage performer at the outset of the film, basically doing vaudeville shows during the Great Depression in order to make a living. Time is spent upfront showing the state of things in New York City in regards to the struggle to survive in that devastating economic downturn to great effect. We meet her co-performers, a tight-knit little family, including an elderly gentleman who passes for a father figure for her, and we get to know at least Anne and this gentleman well enough in the few early minutes of the film to really feel for them when the theater where they perform is unceremoniously closed down. Cut to Carl Denham, played by an unusually subdued Jack Black, in a meeting with money men, trying to pitch his movie in progress and get more money to go shoot on location at the mysterious island indicated on a map which has just come into his possession. He is portrayed as a man with a vision, throwing his cinematic pearls before moneyed but ignorant swine. The financiers have already sunk $40 Susan into his picture, big bucks back then, and decide to cut their losses and sell off what Jack has filmed so far as stock footage. Jack overhears this and decides to take off with the existing rolls of film plus all the camera equipment to make the movie anyway, despite the loss of his leading actress and all financing. In a manner very similar to the original film, he finds Anne, although here it takes a bit more convincing to talk her into joining him. There's a funny throwaway line in there about his being trustworthy because he's a movie producer. 8. He talks his way onto the ship despite the captain not trusting him and also wrangles playwright Jack Driscoll, Adrian Brody, into coming along in order to finish the only partially done screenplay. It turns out that the only reason Anne decided to come along was because Driscoll was writing the film and she was a big fan of his plays. So, one major difference is that instead of a lowly sailor, Driscoll is a well known and sophisticated playwright. We are also introduced to Hayes Evan Park, who seems to play a role closer to that of the original Driscoll, and Jimmy Jamie Bell as a young former stowaway out to prove himself. Finally, we find ourselves out to sea and on the way to the island. It took a very long time to get to this point, and we also spent what seemed to me to be an inordinate amount of time getting to Skull Island. Peter Jackson took a while developing the relationship between Jack and Anne in order to make it more real for the audience. The problem is that a lot of that effort went to support nothing more than Jack's determination to not leave Anne behind. The real relationship in this movie is between Anne and Kong. Some of you reading this don't even go there. Fortunately, while a lot of time is spent showing the development of the Kong Anne relationship, it is time well spent. Andy Serkis, the actor whose expressions movement is behind the CGI Kong, did a phenomenal job, as did the animators of making Kong real. Much like the original filmmakers, the idea here was that the more fearsome Kong was at the beginning of the film, the more we would feel upon his death. King Kong and Naomi Watts really stole the show here, no question. The time spent on screen showing the both of them was a joy to watch. The process of the relationship changing from fear and curiosity to genuine caring and concern was completely believable. However, when the action shifted to the rest of the crew, things did start to drag. Although the effects were spectacular, there did come times where I found myself thinking, isn't this scene over yet? With a remake of such an iconic film, one cannot help but make comparisons, and many times throughout the film, I asked myself why this one took 3 hours to tell the same story the original did so effectively in half that time. Strangely, the one character that I thought was going to be closest to the original was Carl Denham, and he really wasn't. I actually would have preferred to see Jack Black tap into some of his over the top energy to portray Denham more like the barely suppressed Carnival Barker that Robert Armstrong played in 1933. Jack just never worked for me, but not for the reasons I had expected going in. I think it was more due to Peter Jackson's take on the character than the acting itself. This Denham was more human, yes, but he didn't strike me as the kind of man that would have the sheer force of will required to bring back the great King Kong. towards the end of the film. The scene where Kong is introduced to the paying audience was quite well done and effective, right through to where he escapes his bonds and rampages in Times Square. There is a new sequence in this film showing how Kong calms down once he finds Anne and how they go off and reconnect like old friends until their peace is shattered by the military coming after Kong. Of course, they eventually end up at the top of the Empire State Building, but here again, things seem to go on longer than they need to just for the sake of more screen time with Kong and special effects. When it does come down to the end and Jackson focuses in once more on the characters, it does all come together once more, except for two things. The weakly delivered It Was Beauty Done Killed the Beast by Jack Black, and the final scene between Kong and Naomi Watts, which looked like it was lifted straight from the end of Titanic. Final notes: CGI effects, especially for Kong, were flawless. I did not for a second think I was looking at a CGI creation. The scenes on the island with the natives might be too intense for the 7 and under crowd, some of them looking really creepy and in extreme close ups that even creeped me out a bit. All in all, a really good movie that could have been a great movie if it had 30 minutes or so trimmed from it. Of course, the DVD version will probably be 4 hours long and will no doubt suffer for it. Number 3, before the Monsterverse but after the 1931 original, there was Peter Jackson's reimagining of the Giant Apes story. Taking place during the height of the Great Depression, stage actress Anne Darrow, played by Naomi Watts, is laid off after her theater closes. Meanwhile, filmmaker Carl Denham's, played by Jack Black, latest project does not go over well. The film studio plans on shelving his film and selling his footage as stock footage. Angered Denham plans on illegally making his film. Needing a new lead actress, he and Miss Darrow cross paths as he talks her into his project. Escaping the police via ship, Denham and his crew plan on shooting the film while exploring an undiscovered island, Skull Island. But little do they know the life changing horrors that lie in wait for them as they learn too late that some places are better left off undiscovered. What I love about Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films is his attention to detail, and this is witnessed when we see Skull Island. The island is not just a movie set, it's a completely functional ecosystem and sanctuary for exotic flora and fauna. But don't go thinking it's some peaceful paradise. Once you step foot on Skull Island, you can forget what life you had back home. From the poisonous plants to the giant insects that crawl from each crevice in Skull Island's underbelly, nowhere is safe. But if you thought that was bad enough, you'd be dead wrong, no pun intended. Since Skull Island is the last wonder of the world, there live some creatures long thought to be extinct, such as dinosaurs. Yes, that's right, folks. These dinosaurs have reached the pinnacle of their evolution. For example, the T Rex has evolved into the larger, more terrifying Vastatosaurus rex V Rex, which have a long, brutal rivalry with the Kong species. The crew that travels to Skull Island is easily an allegory for white colonization, and Peter Jackson takes ample time to introduce and make them seem multi-dimensional and affable until the right time. Take Carl Denham, for example. We meet him as a down on his luck filmmaker who wishes to keep his dream alive by whatever means necessary. However, he's also power hungry and greedy. He places his own vanity project over the safety of his crew. This is on full display when he gives an inversed version of Samwise Gamgee's speech from the Two Towers, and to no one's surprise, when his film falls through, he insists on bringing Kong back to the States via chloroform so he can profit off a live show. So why does Jackson do this? Why does he want us to root for the bad guys? I think it's because villains in the real world aren't your stereotypical mustache twirling, irredeemable bad guys. They are people just like you and me. And I think it's very important to show them as such so we get a better understanding of what drives them. So, there is one major issue I have with Jackson's King Kong, the portrayal of the Skull Island natives. Knowing Skull Island's hypothetical location is off of Malaysia, the natives would be based on the Polynesians or Malay. However, they are portrayed to be savages, complete with deranged red eyes, deformed facial features, and practicing human sacrifice. Hell, they feel more like Uruk-hai rejects from the Two Towers than natives of a lost civilization. Oh, but it gets worse than that. You see, the extras hired for the scene were actually Malay, but had their skin painted black to portray the natives. Problematic? I think so. Throughout the film, I was asking myself, is it racist to use 1930s filmmaking techniques to tell a story from the 1930s? Yes. It'd be like if we still use yellow face today. And before you try to defend the film for pointing out how these methods and views were racist, Jackson's movie makes no such attempt. The natives appear, terrorize our protagonists, kidnap and attempt to sacrifice Anne and disappear for the remainder of the runtime. I remember seeing advertisements all over when this film came out. The TV ads showing a giant ape fighting two Vrexes or slugging it out with biplanes on top of the Empire State Building was nothing short of exhilarating. But that was part of the movie's problem. It was advertised as a fun action adventure. The reality, a 3 hour long drama with action scenes sprinkled in. Peter Jackson wanted to recapture the magic of his LOTR trilogy, and since those movies were 3 hours long, he decided it couldn't hurt to have King Kong match that length. While the film wasn't exactly a slog to sit through, those who showed up for the action alone were left waiting for about an hour and a half for any of it. This is only exacerbated with scenes that serve little to no purpose other than to drag out the film's runtime, such as seeing Anne and Kong ice skating in New York. King Kong 2005 made a whopping $557 million on a budget of a staggering $207 million. Additionally, it won 3 Academy Awards: Best Sound Editing, Sound Mixing and Visual Effects, along with a Golden Globe nomination for Best Director. In 2013, Jackson revealed that he planned to produce a prequel with Adam Wingard attached to direct. According to Wingard, the prequel would take place in WW1. However, these plans fell through when the rights of King Kong transferred from Universal to Warner Brothers. Eventually, Warner Brothers decided to reboot the franchise with Kong Skull Island set in the Monsterverse. Was this the right call? I think so. Despite the massive commercial and critical success that was King Kong 2005, I think a prequel would have garnered a similar reception to War of the Rohirrim. In other words, it would been an interesting addition to the world of King Kong, but wouldn't have really been necessary. With all of this said, does Peter Jackson's King Kong still hold up today? Quite frankly, yes. Despite some troubling portrayal of the Skull Island natives, the world building and nuanced storytelling on white colonialism is more than enough to stand the test of time. I think what really prevented this film from being truly great was its pacing and false advertising. Although I understand the reasons for this false advertising, it was also part of the reason why some were disappointed when they found out it wasn't what they were expecting. Despite the Monster vs. version of Kong being the fan favorite, it's still worth it to give Peter Jackson's rendition a watch. You might just find a new perspective and appreciation for King Kong.